Come close now, children of memory. Sit where the dust of time ain't settled yet. I speak with the voice that don't sleep, the voice that crossed the salt of the Middle Passage, that creaked in them ship bellies and learned to count the world by heartbeats. I bring you a living remembrance, not to wound for pleasure, but to remember for justice. Today I tell the story of Abigail of the Hot Iron, and I ask for silence, 'cause this name still smokes. In them bayous of Louisiana, where the Spanish moss hangs like the ghosts of the hanged, where the cypress trees whisper secrets older than America itself, there lived folks who knew that some names carry fire. Not all names was made to be forgotten. No, sir. Some names burn through generations like hot coals passed hand to hand, and each time they touch a soul, they leave their mark. Abigail, that's a name that ain't meant for soft tongues or gentle whispers. That's a name that cuts through the night like a conjure woman's blade, sharp and true and terrible. Old folks say that when a child is born with eyes that see too much, the ancestors already know the path that child gonna walk. They know the weight that little soul gonna carry, the fire it gonna face, and the choice it gonna make when the world tries to break it down to nothing. Abigail came into this world on a night when the hoot owls was silent and the dogs wouldn't howl. Even the earth seemed to hold its breath, like it knew something powerful was stirring in the darkness. The midwife, old Mama Roo, who knew root work and conjure like other folks know their own names, she took one look at that baby and whispered words that chilled every soul in that cabin. "This child got iron in her blood," she said, her voice trembling like leaves before a storm. "Iron that gonna be tested, iron that gonna be heated, iron that gonna choose its own destiny." Then she wrapped that baby in a quilt made from scraps of African cloth, pieces her own grandmother smuggled across the ocean in her hair, and she blessed that child with words in a language the white folks never learned to understand. Listen here, children. Don't be fooled by the softness of morning light or the sweet song of mockingbirds. Evil don't always come with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes dressed in Sunday clothes, riding a fine horse, speaking words smooth as honey dripping from the comb. The plantation where Abigail grew from child to woman was such a place, beautiful as a picture painted for rich folks' parlors, terrible as the devil's own workshop. Master Caldwell, that was the name of the man who thought he owned people like he owned cotton and horses. He was what folks called a gentleman planter, had education from up north, spoke French like he was born to it, could quote scripture, chapter and verse when it suited his purposes. But I tell you true, the devil knows scripture too, and he uses it like a whip when the mood strikes him. Caldwell's plantation stretched from the river bend to the pine forest, thousands of acres of dark earth that drank blood like a thirsty thing. The big house sat on a rise like a white throne, with columns tall as trees and windows that caught the light like watching eyes. From them windows, Caldwell could see everything. The quarters where his slaves lived packed tight as cargo, the fields where they bent their backs from dawn to dusk, the whipping post that stood in the yard like a scarred monument to human cruelty. That post was made from heart pine, harder than iron, stained dark with the blood of too many backs to count. But the house held secrets too. In the basement, where the wine was kept cool and the silver was stored safe, there was a room that didn't appear on no blueprint. The overseer called it the disciplinary chamber, but the slaves had another name for it. They called it the iron room, 'cause that's where Master Caldwell kept his collection of branding irons, each one shaped different, each one designed to mark flesh with his particular brand of ownership. Now, Abigail, she was maybe 10 years old when she first heard about that room, heard it in whispers that stopped soon as grown folk saw her listening, heard it in the nightmares that made strong men cry in their sleep, heard it in the way certain slaves walked careful, like they was carrying invisible wounds that never quite healed right. The quarters where Abigail lived was a double row of cabins built from rough pine boards, chinked with mud and moss to keep out the winter wind. Each cabin housed 2 families, sometimes 3 if children was small. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford, but they made their own kind of privacy, with quilts hung from rope and voices kept low when secrets needed telling. Abigail's mama, Sarah, worked in the big house kitchen, which meant she saw things that field hands never saw the way Master Caldwell's eyes would linger on the young women who served at table, saw the bruises on girls who was called up to the house after dark, saw the fear in every soul who walked them marble floors, knowing that one wrong step, one spilled drop of tea, one glance held too long could mean a visit to that iron room. "Keep your eyes down, child," Sarah would whisper to Abigail when she was old enough to understand. "Keep your mouth closed and your thoughts to yourself. This world ain't made for folks like us to speak our minds." But even as she spoke them words, Sarah could see something in her daughter's eyes that worried her. Abigail's eyes didn't drop easy. They held steady, like they was measuring everything they saw, storing it up for some future reckoning. The child learned early to read the signs that meant trouble was coming. When Master Caldwell's horse came back from town with the reins held too tight, when the overseer walked through the quarters with his hand resting on his whip, when the dinner bell rang twice instead of once, which meant someone was about to face the post. These signs was like weather to Abigail. She could smell them coming before they arrived, could feel them in the weight of the air and the nervous flutter of the chickens in the yard. Before the fire, there was a girl who loved to watch the sunrise paint the world gold. Before the iron learned her flesh, there was a child who believed in the stories her grandmother told about flying people and the day when all chains would turn to dust. Before the pain taught her to separate body from spirit, there was Abigail, whole and hopeful as morning glory blooming on the fence. Lord, have mercy on my old heart, but I remember that child like she was my own blood. Had hair that caught sunlight and held it, skin smooth as river stones, and hands that was always busy with something, braiding sweetgrass, carving patterns in the dirt, helping her mama in ways that went beyond her years. She moved through the world like water moves around rocks, finding her way without making much disturbance, but always flowing towards something the rest of us couldn't see yet. Abigail learned her letters from an old slave named Solomon, who'd been taught to read by a master's son up in Virginia before he was sold south. This was dangerous knowledge, understand. Teaching slaves to read was against the law in Louisiana, punishable by whipping for the teacher and worse for the student. But Solomon was clever about it. He'd gather children around in the evening, pretending to tell stories. And while his voice spun tales of Anansi the spider and Brer Rabbit's tricks, his finger would trace letters in the dirt, teaching them the shapes that held power. "Words is weapons," Solomon would whisper, his old voice carrying the weight of years. "But they's also wings. Learn them right, and they can cut through chains. Learn them wrong, and they'll cut through you." Abigail drank in them lessons like parched earth drinks rain, storing up letters and sounds and meanings in the safe places of her mind where Master Caldwell's eyes couldn't reach. The plantation had its own rhythm, cruel as a heartbeat that wouldn't quit. 4:30 in the morning, the overseer's horn would blow across the quarters like the voice of Judgment Day. By 5, every soul over 12 had to be in the fields, ready to face another day of back-breaking labor under the Louisiana sun. Cotton in season, rice in the flood fields, corn and sweet potatoes when the calendar turned. The work never stopped, never eased, never showed mercy for weakness or sickness or the simple human need to rest. But children under 12, they had different work. Housework if they was lucky and learned to move quiet. Yard work, tending the kitchen garden, feeding chickens, carrying water. Abigail did her share of all this, but what she did best was listen. Child had ears like a bat, could hear conversations through walls, could catch whispers carried on the wind. She heard the grown folks planning small rebellions. How to slow down the work without getting caught. How to hide a little extra cornmeal for the hungry times. How to pass messages from plantation to plantation when someone was sold away. And she heard other things too. Things that chilled her young blood and made her understand that the world she lived in was built on cruelty, as surely as the big house was built on cypress foundations. She heard Master Caldwell talking to his overseer about discipline, about making examples, about the need to keep the slaves fearful and compliant. She heard him say words that no child should ever have to hear, words about breaking spirits and owning souls, and the various tools that could be used to remind human beings that they was considered property. The iron room, she learned, wasn't just for punishment, it was for marking. Every slave on the Caldwell plantation carried the master's brand somewhere on their body, a letter C intertwined with a cross, burned into flesh with an iron-heated cherry red in the forge. Most masters branded their slaves on the hand or shoulder, somewhere visible to anyone who might question their ownership. But Master Caldwell was particular about his marking. He chose different spots for different people, sometimes in places hidden by clothing, sometimes not. The pain was always the same, but the shame varied according to his whims. Abigail was 8 years old when she saw her first branding. A young man named Thomas had been caught trying to run away, brought back by the paddy rollers with dog's teeth marks still bleeding on his legs. The whole plantation was forced to watch as Thomas was stripped and tied to the whipping post. First came the lash, 20 strokes that painted the post red and filled the air with screams that the mockingbirds would echo for days afterward. Then came the iron. Master Caldwell heated it himself in a small forge brought out special for the occasion. Heated it till it glowed like a piece of the sun. And while Thomas begged and wept and called on Jesus to deliver him, that iron found his flesh and left its permanent signature. The smell that rose from burning skin mixed with the smell of fierce sweat and blood, creating a stench that would linger in Abigail's memory forever. But what scared Abigail most wasn't the pain in Thomas's screams. It was the look in Master Caldwell's eyes as he watched. There was pleasure there, satisfaction, like a man enjoying a fine meal or a beautiful sunset. This wasn't just punishment to him. This was artistry. This was the exercise of godlike power over human flesh, and he savored every moment of it like communion wine. That night, Abigail asked her mama why God allowed such things to happen to his children. Sarah held her daughter close and spoke words that would echo through the years to come. God sees everything, baby girl. He keeps his own accounts, and someday them accounts gonna come due. But sometimes God needs human hands to do his work on earth. Sometimes he needs someone willing to carry his fire. The place where time don't walk forward like it should, where every day feels like the same day lived over and over till madness starts knocking at the mind's door. That was the Caldwell plantation in them days of deep sorrow. Time moved different when you was property, when your life belonged to someone else's whims, and your future stretched no farther than the next harvest. The sun rose and set like clockwork, but the days themselves blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Picture this if you can bear to. 700 acres of rich delta soil, black as sin and twice as fertile, stretching from the muddy banks of the Mississippi to the edge of the cypress swamp where the alligators lurked and the Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds. The big house commanded it all from its position on the only rise for miles around, white columns gleaming like bones in the morning sun, wraparound galleries where the master's family could sit in shade while watching their human property sweat and bleed under the merciless Louisiana sky. Below the big house, the quarters stretched in 2 neat rows like a military camp designed by the devil himself. 40 cabins in all, each one measuring maybe 12 feet by 16, housing anywhere from 6 to 10 souls depending on how many children the Lord had seen fit to send. The cabins was built rough, with gaps between the boards wide enough for winter wind to whistle through, and roofs that leaked when the rains came heavy. Each cabin had 1 window, no glass, just wooden shutters that could be closed against storms, and 1 door that couldn't be locked from the inside. Between the quarters and the big house stood the symbols of absolute power. The whipping post, dark with old blood and carved with the names of them that had suffered there. The overseer's house, where Malcolm Burke lived with his bottles of rot-gut whiskey and his collection of whips. And the bell tower, where a iron bell the size of a wash basin called the slaves to work each morning and warned of runaways with its frantic tolling. But it was the building behind the big house that held the deepest terror, though few slaves ever saw inside it. Built like a stone tomb, with walls thick enough to muffle screams and a chimney that often smoked when there was no fire in any hearth. This was where Master Caldwell kept his special tools, where discipline became an art form practiced with scientific precision. The slaves called it different names, the firehouse, the branding shed, the place of no return, but they all meant the same thing, hell on earth with a man-made roof. Now folks today, they got trouble understanding how such evil could exist in a land that called itself Christian, in a country that spoke of freedom and justice like they was sacred words. But I tell you true, slavery wasn't just about free labor. It was about the complete domination of one human being by another, the systematic destruction of dignity and hope, the reduction of God's children to the level of livestock. And there wasn't no cruelty too terrible to inflict if it served the purpose of keeping people in bondage. Master Caldwell understood this better than most. He'd studied plantation management up at some fancy college, learned the science of breaking human spirits like other men learned to break horses. He knew that physical pain alone wasn't enough. A man could endure pain if he held on to hope. But if you could make that man complicit in his own degradation, if you could twist his mind until he believed he deserved his suffering, then you had true control. That's why the Iron Room existed, not just for punishment but for ceremony, for the ritual transformation of human beings into property. Every slave on the plantation would be marked eventually, but Master Caldwell made each marking into an event, a public display of his absolute authority. He would choose his time carefully, when resistance was brewing or when someone had shown too much independence. Then would come the summons, delivered by the overseer with his cat-o'-nine-tails coiled at his belt like a sleeping snake. The iron itself was a work of craftsmanship, forged by the best blacksmith in New Orleans to Master Caldwell's exact specifications. The letter C intertwined with a cross, each line and curve designed to leave the clearest possible mark on human flesh. But that wasn't the only iron in his collection. Oh no. Master Caldwell was an artist in his way, and he had tools for different purposes, some for marking ownership, some for punishment, some for reasons that only God and the devil knew for certain. Young Abigail learned to read the signs of impending horror the way other children learned to read the weather. When Master Caldwell spent extra time in the iron room, when the chimney smoke carried that particular smell of heating metal, when the overseer walked through the quarters with a list in his hand, all these things meant someone was about to face the fire. The air would grow heavy with dread, children would cling closer to their mothers, and grown men would pray harder than usual to whatever gods still listened to the cries of the enslaved. The tools of this particular kind of hell was varied as the devil's imagination. Besides the branding irons, there was shackles and chains, whips of every description, thumbscrews for the delicate work of extracting confessions, and implements whose purpose I won't describe to spare your ears the horror. All kept clean and sharp and ready, polished like communion silver and blessed with the Master's unholy prayers. But the most terrible tool of all was time itself. See, Master Caldwell didn't hurry his work. He would heat the iron slow, letting anticipation build like water behind a dam. He would speak during the process, explaining what was happening and why, making conversation like he was discussing the weather while human flesh sizzled under his touch. This wasn't rage or passion. This was cold, calculated evil dressed up in the clothes of civilization. The quarters would fall silent when someone was taken to the iron room. No singing that night, no storytelling, no laughter from the children. Even the babies seemed to sense the wrongness in the air and would cry softer, as if they understood that too much noise might bring unwanted attention. And when the victim finally returned, if they returned, they carried more than physical scars. They carried the knowledge that human cruelty had no bottom, that there was no suffering so terrible that someone wouldn't inflict it for the sake of maintaining power. This was the world that shaped young Abigail, where every lesson taught the same truth, that black flesh was property, that black pain was entertainment, that black hope was dangerous and must be burned away with iron and fire. But some spirits once lit can't be extinguished by earthly tools. Some flames only grow brighter when folks try to smother them, and Abigail's spirit was already showing signs of being such a flame, though she was still too young to understand the fire that was building in her blood. Soon enough, that fire would be tested. Soon enough, the iron would learn her flesh, and her flesh would learn the iron. But that's a reckoning for another chapter, when the child's story ends and the woman's begins. The first kiss of fire comes to every slave child eventually, but ain't none of them ever ready for it. no matter how much they've been warned. Abigail was 13 summers old when her time came, 13 and tall for her age, with hands that knew work and eyes that still held traces of the dreams her grandmother used to whisper about. Dreams of flying people and rivers that ran backwards, and days when the earth would open up and swallow all the chains. It was harvest time, and the cotton fields stretched white as far as the eye could see, each plant heavy with fiber that would make rich men richer and keep blackbacks bent under the Louisiana sun. The work quota had been raised again. Master Caldwell needed extra profit that year to pay for renovations to the big house, and every soul on the plantation felt the pressure like a weight sitting on their chest. From can see to can't see, the slaves worked with bleeding fingers and aching backs, dragging their cotton sacks through rows that seemed to stretch into eternity. Abigail worked alongside her mama in the house that week, helping prepare meals for the harvest hands who came from neighboring plantations to help with the picking. Extra workers meant extra mouths to feed, and the kitchen stayed busy from before dawn till after dark, cooking great pots of cornbread and beans, slicing bacon thin to make it stretch, keeping the coffee hot and strong. It was good work for a young girl, better than field work, safer than some other duties that befell pretty girls on plantations, but it came with its own dangers. The harvest hands was rough men, white trash mostly, who worked for wages but looked at slave women like they was part of the payment. They'd grab at the girls who served food, make comments that would shame a decent person, and expect smiles in return for their crude attention. Abigail had learned to move quick and keep her eyes down, but even so, she caught unwanted notice from a man named Jebediah Morse, who had yellow teeth and breath that smelled like rot-gut whiskey and pure meanness. "You got yourself a fine young filly there, Caldwell," she heard him say to Master Caldwell one evening, as they sat on the gallery drinking bourbon and discussing the price of cotton. "Bet she'd clean up real nice if someone took the time to train her proper." The laughter that followed that comment made Abigail's skin crawl, like snakes was sliding across her flesh. Master Caldwell's response chilled her blood even more than Morse's crude suggestion. "Patience, friend," he said in that smooth voice that always meant trouble. "Good things come to those who wait. But first, she needs proper breaking in. Can't have a spirited horse if you don't break it to saddle first." More laughter, and the clink of glasses raised in some unholy toast. That night, Abigail couldn't sleep for the fear that settled in her bones like winter cold. She lay in the cabin listening to her mama's breathing, and the soft sounds of other families shifting in their sleep, and she knew that her childhood was about to end in the worst possible way. Come morning, the overseer would find some excuse to call her name, and then would come the walk to the iron room that every slave dreaded above all other earthly suffering. She was right. Dawn came gray and heavy, with storm clouds building over the Mississippi, and the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Abigail was in the kitchen kneading dough for the day's bread, when Malcolm Burke darkened the doorway, his pale eyes scanning the room till they settled on her like a hawk spotting prey. "You, girl. Master wants to see you in the special room." His voice carried no emotion, but his hand rested casual-like on the whip at his belt, and Abigail knew there was no point in running. Where could she run to? The swamp was full of alligators and snakes. The river was watched by paddy rollers with dogs. The roads led nowhere except to other plantations, where black flesh was property and black pain was sport. The walk from the kitchen to the iron room felt like walking to her own execution. Each step echoed in her ears like a funeral drum, and the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks looked like mourning veils swaying in the still air. Behind her, she could feel the eyes of other slaves watching from whatever hiding places they could find, their hearts breaking for her, but their voices silent out of necessity. Speaking up would only mean joining her in that terrible place. The iron room squatted behind the big house like a toad made of stone, its single window covered with iron bars, and its chimney already smoking with preparations for what was to come. Master Caldwell waited inside, dressed in his finest clothes as if this was some kind of holy ceremony, instead of the desecration it truly was. The forge glowed red in the corner, and several irons rested in the coals, their handles wrapped in leather to protect the hands that would wield them. "Come in, child." Master Caldwell said, his voice gentle as a preacher's but his eyes holding depths that no child should ever have to see. "Don't be afraid. We're just going to have a little conversation about respect and obedience and the proper order of things." He gestured to a chair that had been bolted to the floor, its arms fitted with leather straps worn smooth by countless struggles. Abigail stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched like eternity, feeling the weight of her ancestors' eyes upon her, hearing the whispered prayers of her mother and the silent screams of all who had entered this room before her. In that moment, she made a choice that would echo through all the days to come. She would not beg. She would not weep. She would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her spirit break under his tools. She walked to the chair with her head held high, like a queen approaching her throne instead of a child approaching her torture. And when the first iron found her flesh, the letter C burned into her left shoulder blade where it would be hidden by her dress but felt with every movement. She bit through her tongue rather than scream, filling her mouth with blood that tasted like iron and rage, and the bitter knowledge that some wounds never heal. But even as the fire painted its permanent mark on her body, something else was being born in the depths of Abigail's soul. Call it hatred, call it determination, call it the spirit of every ancestor who had died in chains. Whatever its name, it blazed hotter than any Iron Master Caldwell could heat in his forge. And though he didn't know it yet, in marking her as his property, he had also marked himself for a reckoning that would come when she was ready to deliver it. When pain becomes your daily bread, when fire learns your flesh like a familiar friend, something happens to the soul that outsiders can't understand. It ain't breaking, though that's what the masters hoped for. It ain't surrendering, though that's what they prayed to see. No, what happens is a kind of alchemy, a transformation of suffering into something harder than iron, sharper than any blade forged by human hands. Abigail learned this truth over the months that followed her first visit to the iron room. That shoulder blade where the sea had been burned stayed tender for weeks, aching when she moved wrong, reminding her with every breath that she wore another man's mark on her flesh. But the mark didn't make her his, no matter what the law book said. If anything, it made her more herself than she'd ever been before, like heat that purifies metal and burns away everything that ain't essential. The work continued as it always had. Cotton in season, rice in the flood fields, vegetables in the kitchen garden, and always the endless tasks that kept a plantation running. But Abigail moved through her days different now, carrying herself with a stillness that worried her mama, and caught the attention of the other slaves. She spoke less, listened more, and her eyes had taken on a quality that made folks uncomfortable, like she was seeing things the rest of them couldn't see yet. Master Caldwell noticed the change too, and it pleased him in ways that were purely devilish. He'd broken stronger slaves than this slip of a girl, had watched grown men weep like babies after a few sessions in the iron room. But Abigail's silence intrigued him, challenged him in ways that made the whole business more interesting than usual. She was a puzzle to be solved, a code to be cracked, and he had all the time in the world to do it. The second branding came just before Christmas, when the work slowed down and Master Caldwell had more time for his special hobbies. This time it was for talking back to the overseer. At least that was the official reason. Truth was, Abigail had simply looked Malcolm Burke in the eye when he spoke to her, had failed to drop her gaze quick enough to satisfy his sense of proper order. Such a small thing. But in the world of slavery, maintaining eye contact was rebellion enough to warrant punishment. This time the iron found her right hip, hidden beneath the rough fabric of her work dress. The pain was no less terrible than before, but Abigail had learned to separate her body from her spirit during the burning, to send her mind to other places while her flesh suffered under Master Caldwell's artistic attention. She thought about her grandmother's stories of the flying people, about the time before ships and chains and auction blocks, about rivers that ran backwards and carried their children home. "You're learning," Master Caldwell murmured as he worked, his voice holding the satisfaction of a teacher whose student was finally grasping a difficult lesson. "Pain is a language, child. The sooner you become fluent in it, the easier your life will be." But even as he spoke, Something in Abigail's stillness bothered him. She was too quiet, too controlled, too much like she was enduring rather than breaking. The third branding came in spring, for the crime of teaching another slave child to read. Solomon had been caught and whipped to death for his teaching, but before he died, he named Abigail as one who'd helped spread the dangerous gift of literacy. The iron that time marked her left wrist, a small brand that could be hidden by long sleeves, but served as a permanent reminder of the price of knowledge. By the fourth branding, in the heat of summer, Abigail had stopped counting the reasons. It was enough that Master Caldwell wanted to mark her, wanted to add to his collection of scars on her young body. This time the iron found her ankle, and as it sizzled against her skin, she realized that each mark was teaching her something valuable: how to breathe through pain, how to hold her mind separate from her body, how to transform suffering into a kind of fuel that burned slow and steady, and would last as long as she needed it to. The other slaves began to whisper about her. Some said she was conjured, protected by root work that kept the pain from touching her soul. Others claimed she was already dead inside, that the fire had burned away everything human and left only a shell. But the old women, the ones who'd survived more than their share of masters and overseers and iron rooms, they recognized something different in Abigail's stillness. They saw the coiled stillness of a snake before it strikes, the gathered tension of a storm before it breaks. "That child got lightning in her blood," old Mama Celia whispered to the women who gathered to card cotton in the evenings. "Mark my words, that lightning gonna find its way out eventually, and when it do, it gonna light up the sky for miles around." She'd seen enough of life to recognize the signs, had watched other slaves transform under the weight of too much suffering. Most broke and became shadows of themselves. A few went mad and had to be put down like rabid dogs. But every once in a great while, one would turn into something harder and more dangerous than anything their masters had bargained for. Abigail's transformation wasn't obvious to casual observation. She still worked her assigned tasks, still spoke when spoken to, still moved through the plantation like just another piece of property going about its duties. But those who knew how to look could see the changes, the way she tested the strength of rope when she thought no one was watching, the way her eyes would linger on the tools in the blacksmith's shed, the way she listened with particular attention when the men talked about the geography of surrounding parishes and the best routes to the river. She was learning, studying, preparing for something she couldn't name yet, but could feel approaching like distant thunder. Each brand added to her education in suffering, but also added to her understanding of the men who inflicted it. She learned that Master Caldwell heated his irons to specific temperatures for specific effects, that he chose his locations based on complex calculations of pain and visibility and psychological impact. She learned that he talked during the branding to distract himself from the possibility that what he was doing might be wrong. Most importantly, she learned that he was afraid of losing control, afraid of rebellion, afraid that his carefully constructed world of absolute power might someday crumble around him like a house built on sand. That fear drove him to greater and greater extremes of cruelty, but it also revealed his weakness. A man who had to burn children to maintain his authority was a man whose authority rested on nothing more substantial than pain and terror. And pain, Abigail had learned, was temporary. Terror could be overcome. But the rage that was building in her chest, fed by each mark, fueled by each humiliation, strengthened by each day she survived what should have destroyed her, that was eternal. That was something Master Caldwell had created without meaning to, something that would outlast his branding irons and his iron room and his delusions of godlike power. The fifth branding came in autumn, and the sixth in winter. By then Abigail had stopped feeling the fire as pain, and started feeling it as instruction. Each scar was a lesson in the anatomy of evil, each mark a reminder of debts that would someday come due with interest. The iron was teaching her its secrets, showing her its weaknesses, preparing her for the day when she would turn its lessons back on the man who thought he owned her. The man who believed himself to be God wore fine clothes and spoke with educated words. But I tell you true, the devil himself never walked the earth in more dangerous form than Master Harrison Caldwell in them days of blood and bondage. Child, when I speak his name, understand that I don't do it lightly. Some names carry such weight of evil that saying them out loud calls dark things from their hiding places. But this story can't be told without naming the monster, can't be understood without looking straight into the face of human wickedness dressed in gentleman's attire. Master Caldwell was what folks called a gentleman planter, third-generation wealth built on the backs of stolen people. His grandfather had carved the plantation from swampland using slave labor and yellow fever dreams. His father had expanded it with more slaves and more cruelty, and Harrison Caldwell had inherited it all along with the peculiar madness that seemed to run in families who made their fortunes from human misery. But where his ancestors had been content with simple brutality, Harrison had refined cruelty into an art form, had studied suffering like other men studied mathematics or philosophy. He stood tall and straight as a pine tree, with gray eyes cold as winter river water, and hands that stayed soft because other hands did all his work. His hair was the color of Spanish silver, combed back neat and proper, and he favored dark suits that made him look like a preacher or an undertaker, both fitting comparisons for a man who dealt so regularly in souls and death. When he spoke, his voice carried the polish of education and breeding, could quote Shakespeare and scripture with equal facility, could discuss politics and poetry and the proper management of human livestock without changing his tone. But it was his eyes that told the true story. Folks who looked into Harrison Caldwell's eyes saw depths that no Christian soul should ever plumb, saw hungers that no amount of feeding could satisfy, saw the kind of emptiness that could only be filled with other people's pain. He looked at his slaves the way a child looks at insects before pulling off their wings, with curiosity about how much suffering they could endure before they stopped being entertaining. The big house reflected its master's nature, filled with beautiful things acquired through ugly means. Persian rugs bought with rice profits, crystal chandeliers purchased with cotton money, paintings and sculptures that spoke of culture and refinement, while the screams from the iron room provided a different kind of soundtrack. Master Caldwell was particularly proud of his library. 2 stories of leather-bound books on subjects ranging from agriculture to philosophy, including several rare volumes on the management of slave populations that he'd imported from the Caribbean, where such management had been refined into pure science. His wife, Miss Adelaide, was a thin, nervous woman who'd learned early in their marriage to avoid asking questions about the sounds that came from behind the big house. She spent her days in laudanum dreams and watercolor paintings, creating delicate flowers on paper, while her husband cultivated pain in human flesh. The children, 2 sons away at university and a daughter who'd married into Mississippi wealth, had grown up understanding that their comfort depended on their father's particular talents for extracting profit from human bondage. But it was in the iron room that Master Caldwell's true nature revealed itself most completely. He'd designed the space himself, had overseen its construction with the attention to detail that other men might bring to building a chapel. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams, the floor sloped toward drains that could wash away blood, and the forge was built to precise specifications that allowed for exact temperature control. Every tool had its place, every implement its purpose, and Master Caldwell knew them all intimately as a surgeon knows his instruments. He approached the breaking of human spirits with scientific methodology, keeping careful records of which techniques worked best on different temperaments, which tools produced the most lasting psychological effects, which combinations of pain and humiliation most efficiently destroyed the will to resist. His journal, kept locked in a safe behind a false bookshelf, contained detailed observations about the elasticity of human skin under various temperatures, the correlation between physical marking and mental submission, and theories about the hereditary nature of rebelliousness in slave bloodlines. Master Caldwell had studied the great plantations of Jamaica and Saint-Domingue before the revolution there, had corresponded with plantation managers throughout the Caribbean about the most effective methods of maintaining discipline among large slave populations. He understood that simple brutality was inefficient, that random cruelty often bred more resistance than it prevented. True control required precision, required understanding each individual slave's particular vulnerabilities and exploiting them with surgical accuracy. This was why Abigail fascinated him so completely. Most slaves, after the first or second branding, would begin the process of psychological submission that made them manageable. They would develop the proper posture of defeat, the downcast eyes and shuffling gait that signaled complete acceptance of their status as property. But Abigail had done something different. Instead of breaking, she had begun to transform, and Master Caldwell found himself studying her with the intensity of a naturalist observing a new species. He would watch her from the gallery of the big house, noting the way she moved through her tasks with mechanical precision, the way she spoke only when spoken to and kept her responses brief and respectful. On the surface, she appeared to be achieving the desired state of submission, but something in her posture, some quality in her stillness, suggested depths that his usual techniques had failed to reach. This challenge excited him in ways that pure dominance never could. Breaking Abigail completely would require new methods, innovative approaches to the ancient art of destroying human will. He began to experiment, varying the intervals between brandings, changing the locations and patterns of the marks, introducing psychological elements designed to compound the physical trauma. Each session became a laboratory exercise in applied cruelty, with Abigail as both subject and unwitting teacher. What Master Caldwell failed to understand, blinded as he was by his own arrogance, was that his experiments were teaching Abigail as much about him as they were teaching him about her. Every session revealed something about his methods, his thinking, his weaknesses. She was learning to read him as carefully as he thought he was reading her, cataloging his habits and preferences and the particular pleasures that drove his cruelty. She noticed how his breathing changed when he heated the irons, how his hands would tremble slightly with anticipation before each branding. She observed the way he would pause to admire his work, the pride he took in the precision of his marks, the satisfaction he derived from her enforced silence. Most tellingly, she saw how he would sometimes seem almost disappointed when a session ended, as if he was reluctant to return to the mundane business of running a plantation. These observations accumulated in Abigail's mind, like kindling gathering for a fire. Each detail added to her understanding of the man who held her life in his hands. Each insight brought her closer to seeing him not as an all-powerful master, but as something far more dangerous and far more vulnerable. A human being whose humanity had been corrupted beyond recognition, whose soul had been traded for the temporary illusion of absolute power. Master Caldwell believed he was conducting a scientific study in human nature, but he was actually participating in his own education about the limits of control and the ultimate futility of trying to own another person's spirit. Every mark he added to Abigail's body was also a mark against his own soul, every act of cruelty a step closer to a reckoning he couldn't imagine. The man who thought himself God was about to learn that even gods can bleed when the right hand holds the blade. 400 times. Let that number settle in your mind like lead settling in deep water. 400 visits from the fire, 400 lessons written in flesh, 400 times that iron found skin and left its permanent signature. Count them if you can. I dare you to try. Count them like rosary beads of pain, like marks on a calendar of suffering, like notches on the belt of human cruelty. 400 times the forge heated red. 400 times Master Caldwell practiced his particular artistry on Abigail's flesh. But here's the mystery that confounded that devil in gentleman's clothes. After each marking, after each lesson in agony, after each attempt to write ownership on her body with hot iron, Abigail remained. Not just alive. Any fool with enough stubbornness could survive what shouldn't be survived. No, she remained herself, held on to something essential that all of Master Caldwell's science and all of his tools couldn't touch or tarnish or burn away. The brandings followed no calendar that made sense to ordinary folks. Sometimes days would pass between visits to the iron room, sometimes weeks. Master Caldwell had developed his own rhythm, his own internal clock that told him when another lesson was needed. He studied Abigail like a book he was trying to translate, looking for signs of submission that never quite appeared, searching for the moment when her spirit would finally acknowledge defeat. The excuses grew thinner as the number grew larger. Talking back when she hadn't spoken, looking up when her eyes had been cast down, moving too fast, moving too slow, breathing too loud, not breathing loud enough. Truth was, Master Caldwell didn't need excuses anymore. The plantation was his kingdom, she was his property, and the iron was his scepter. Justice was whatever he said it was. Punishment was whatever his imagination could devise. By the 50th branding, the other slaves had begun to whisper that Abigail was under some kind of conjure protection. Old Mama Celia spoke of rootwork so powerful it could turn flesh to stone, of ancestors so strong they could stand between the living and the fire. But Abigail knew different. She wasn't protected by magic. She was being forged by pain, hammer-struck into something harder than the iron that marked her. The 100th marking came on a day when the Spanish moss hung still as death and the air was thick enough to chew. Master Caldwell had invited guests that day, other plantation owners curious about his methods, physicians interested in his theories about the relationship between physical pain and mental submission. Abigail's suffering became entertainment, her flesh a canvas for demonstrating technique. "Observe the precision," Master Caldwell explained to his audience as he heated the iron to cherry-red perfection. "Temperature is crucial. Too cool and the mark won't hold. Too hot and you risk permanent damage to the muscle tissue underneath. We want permanence, gentlemen, but we also want functionality." His voice held the same tone a professor might use when discussing literature or philosophy, as if human flesh was just another academic subject to be mastered. That day, watching the faces of the men who observed her pain, Abigail understood something that would guide her through all the markings to come. These weren't monsters in the sense of creatures foreign to human nature. These were men who looked like fathers and brothers and sons, men who probably said prayers before meals and kissed their wives goodnight. The evil they committed wasn't alien. It was human evil, the kind that could flourish anywhere that power went unchecked and conscience was sold for profit. The 200th marking fell on Christmas Eve, a blasphemy that didn't seem to trouble Master Caldwell's Christian sensibilities. "Even our Lord was born to suffer," he said as he worked, quoting scripture while practicing cruelty. "Suffering purifies the soul, child. Each mark brings you closer to understanding your proper place in God's order." But Abigail had stopped listening to his theology lessons. She had found other things to think about during the fire. She thought about the stories her grandmother used to tell about the time before chains, about kingdoms in Africa, where black people ruled themselves and built cities that touched the sky. She thought about the rivers her ancestors had known, rivers that ran free and carried no ships full of stolen people. She thought about languages that predated English, about gods older than Christianity, about forms of power that didn't require the ownership of other human beings. The 300th marking came in spring, when the cotton plants were just beginning to push through the dark earth, and the promise of another brutal harvest season stretched ahead like a sentence of death. By then, Abigail's body was a map of Master Caldwell's obsession, marked from shoulder to ankle with his initials and symbols, crosses and letters that spelled out ownership in the language of scar tissue. But something strange had begun to happen during these sessions. Instead of growing more efficient at breaking her spirit, Master Caldwell seemed to be growing more frustrated, more desperate in his attempts to achieve the complete submission he craved. His breathing would become labored during the brandings. His hands would shake with something that might have been excitement, or might have been fear, and sometimes he would pause in his work as if he was the one being studied, instead of the one doing the studying. The other slaves noticed the change in him too. His temper grew shorter with everyone on the plantation, his punishments more arbitrary and severe. He had house slaves whipped for imaginary infractions, field hands sold away for crimes that existed only in his imagination. The quarters grew quiet as a graveyard, with folks moving through their tasks like ghosts afraid to disturb the living. But Abigail moved through it all with a stillness that had begun to unnerve even Master Caldwell himself. She performed her duties without complaint, spoke when spoken to with perfect courtesy, and endured each new marking with a composure that seemed to mock his efforts rather than submit to them. Her silence had become a form of resistance more powerful than any rebellion. Her endurance a challenge that grew stronger with each failed attempt to break it. The 400th marking came on a day when the air itself seemed to hold its breath, when even the mockingbirds fell silent and the Spanish moss hung motionless as morning veils. Master Caldwell prepared for the session with unusual care, selecting his finest iron, heating it to perfect temperature, arranging his tools with the precision of a surgeon preparing for delicate operation. "This is a milestone, child," he said as he worked, his voice carrying a tremor that might have been anticipation or might have been something else entirely. 400 lessons in proper behavior. 400 reminders of your place in the natural order. Surely even the most stubborn spirit must acknowledge such thorough instruction. But as the iron found flesh for the 400th time, something in Abigail's eyes told him that his instruction had taught her something very different from what he'd intended. She had learned that pain was finite, that human cruelty had limits even when human creativity did not. She had learned that a man who needed 400 brandings to make his point was a man whose point was fundamentally weak. She had learned that power based on fear was fragile as spun glass, and that sometimes the best way to break such power was simply to refuse to break oneself. Most importantly, she had learned that Master Caldwell was afraid that his methods weren't working, afraid that his absolute authority was an illusion, afraid that the very intensity of his efforts to control her was proof of how completely he had failed to control her. Each mark he added to her body was also a mark of his own desperation, each branding a confession that his power was not as absolute as he needed to believe. The iron had taught Abigail its secrets, had shown her the difference between temporary pain and permanent damage, had revealed the anatomy of the tools that would soon change hands. And as Master Caldwell completed his 400th lesson, he had no way of knowing that he had just graduated his most dangerous student, that all his careful instruction was about to be turned back on the instructor in ways his scientific mind could never have predicted. 400 times, but the 401st time would be different. The 401st time, the iron would find different flesh, would write its message in different skin, would teach its final lesson to the man who thought himself its master. Still she remained. After 400 kisses from the fire, after 400 lessons in submission, after 400 attempts to write surrender on her flesh with hot iron, still Abigail stood upright in the world. And this fact, more than any rebellion or escape attempt, began to eat at Master Caldwell's mind, like acid eats through metal, slow and steady, and impossible to stop. The man who believed himself a scientist of human nature found his most fundamental theories crumbling before his eyes. According to every text he'd studied, every expert he'd consulted, every method he'd perfected over years of practice, Abigail should have been broken long ago. Should have been reduced to that shuffling, empty-eyed compliance that marked a properly managed slave. Should have learned to fear him with the complete and total fear that made resistance unthinkable. Instead, something had gone wrong with his experiment. Instead of submission, he had created something else entirely. A stillness that felt more like coiled steel than defeat. A silence that spoke louder than screams. A presence that seemed to fill whatever room she entered, despite her attempts to remain invisible. Master Caldwell found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering what thoughts moved behind those dark eyes, what dreams survived in a mind that should have been emptied of everything except obedience. The other slaves had begun to notice the change in both of them. Master Caldwell grew more irritable with each passing day, more likely to order punishments for minor infractions, more prone to spending long hours in his study staring at his journals and muttering to himself about the unpredictable nature of human psychology. Meanwhile, Abigail moved through her tasks with a mechanical precision that somehow felt more unsettling than any display of emotion would have been. She worked in the big house kitchen now, promoted from field work in what Master Caldwell told himself was a reward for her improved behavior. Truth was, he wanted her closer, wanted to observe her more carefully, wanted to catch some glimpse of the thoughts that moved behind her carefully controlled exterior. He would find excuses to walk through the kitchen, to inspect work that needed no inspection, to speak to her about trivial matters just to hear the tone of her voice. "You're learning," he would say to her sometimes, studying her face for some reaction to his words. "Pain is indeed a language, and you're becoming quite fluent." But her responses remained perfectly neutral, perfectly appropriate, perfectly empty of any emotion that might give him insight into her true state of mind. "Yes, Master Caldwell," she would say, or "Thank you for the lesson, Master Caldwell." Words that meant nothing and everything at the same time. It was the kitchen work that gave Abigail her most valuable education, though Master Caldwell never realized what he was teaching her. She learned the layout of the big house better than any blueprint could show, learned which floorboards creaked and which doors hung loose on their hinges, learned the habits of everyone who lived above stairs, and the routines that governed their daily lives. She learned that Master Caldwell rose every morning at 5:30 and spent an hour in his study reviewing plantation records before breakfast. She learned that he kept a loaded pistol in the desk drawer of his study and another under his pillow upstairs. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong, that he preferred his eggs soft-boiled, that he had a weakness for peach preserves made from fruit grown in the plantation orchard. Most importantly, she learned about the key he wore on a chain around his neck, the key that opened the special cabinet in his study where he kept his most prized possessions, the detailed journals documenting his experiments in human psychology, the correspondence with other plantation owners about innovative discipline techniques, and the collection of small iron brands he'd had specially made for marking his most defiant slaves. Watching him move through his morning routine, Abigail began to understand that Master Caldwell's confidence was a performance, carefully maintained for the benefit of his family and his peers. In private moments, when he thought no one was watching, she could see cracks in his composure, signs of doubt and frustration that he worked hard to hide from the rest of the world. She saw how his hands would shake slightly when he poured his morning coffee, how he would sometimes pause in the middle of reading his mail, as if he'd forgotten what the words meant, how he would stand at his study window for long minutes, staring out at the slave quarters with an expression that looked more like fear than authority. The man who presented himself as master of all he surveyed was actually consumed by anxiety about his ability to control the human beings he claimed to own. This knowledge was more valuable than any weapon, more powerful than any conjure bag or protective charm. Abigail began to catalog these moments of weakness, storing them away against some future need, building a map of vulnerabilities that might someday prove useful. She learned to read the signs that meant he was having doubts about his methods, learned to recognize the particular kind of anger that came from fear rather than confidence. The other house slaves began to notice changes in her too, though they couldn't name exactly what was different. She moved through her tasks with the same quiet efficiency as always, but there was something in her posture that suggested coiled energy rather than resignation. When she chopped vegetables, the knife seemed to move with more precision than necessary. When she stirred pots over the fire, her eyes would linger on the flames with an intensity that made others uncomfortable. Old Mama Celia, who worked in the laundry and had eyes that saw everything, pulled Abigail aside one evening after the day's work was done. "Child," she said, her voice low and careful, "I seen many things in my time on this earth. Seen slaves broke so bad they forgot their own names. Seen others go mad from suffering and have to be put down like rabid dogs. But I ain't never seen what I'm seeing in you." "What do you mean, Mama Celia?" Abigail asked, though she suspected she knew. "You changing, baby girl. Not breaking, changing. Like iron in the forge, getting harder with each heating instead of softer. That man think he's making you into what he wants, but he's making you into something else entirely, something dangerous." Abigail said nothing, but something in her silence confirmed the old woman's observations. Mama Celia nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for words. "Just remember," the old woman whispered, "when the time comes, and it's coming sure as sunrise, make sure you're ready. Make sure you know exactly what you're going to do and exactly how you're going to do it. 'Cause you only going to get one chance, and if you waste it, won't be nobody left to remember your name." That night, lying in the darkness of the slave cabin, Abigail thought about readiness, She thought about the careful preparation that went into every successful escape, every act of resistance that actually changed something instead of just bringing down more punishment. She thought about timing and opportunity and the difference between revenge and justice. Master Caldwell believed he was conducting a scientific experiment in human nature, but he was actually participating in his own education about the limits of power and the dangers of absolute authority. Every branding session had taught Abigail something new about her oppressor. Every act of cruelty had revealed another weakness in the man who thought himself invincible. The body marked by 400 brands was not the same body that had first entered the Iron Room years ago. That body had belonged to a child who still believed the world might show her mercy. This body belonged to a woman who had learned that mercy was something you created for yourself when no one else would provide it. And soon, very soon, Master Caldwell would learn the difference between owning someone's flesh and owning their spirit. Soon he would discover that pain, when properly applied, could indeed teach valuable lessons, but not always to the person receiving it. The day that would change everything began like any other day in that place where time moved slow as honey and twice as bitter. The auction block in Charleston stood empty in the morning light, its wooden surface still stained dark with tears and blood from yesterday's sale, its iron chains hanging loose like the broken promises of a government that spoke of freedom while trafficking in human souls. But this wasn't just any auction day. This was the spring auction, when Master Caldwell cleared out his surplus stock. The children too young to be useful, the adults too broken to be productive, the elderly who'd outlived their economic value. This was when families got torn apart like pages ripped from a book, when mothers watched their babies sold to strangers, when husbands and wives said goodbye for the last time this side of eternity. Abigail stood in the crowd of slaves assembled for inspection, her body carrying the permanent record of Master Caldwell's artistry, 400 marks that told the story of her education in pain. But today, she was there as a witness, not merchandise. Master Caldwell had no intention of selling his prize pupil, his ongoing experiment in the science of human submission. She was too valuable as a test subject, too perfect an example of his methods to let go. The auctioneer was a fat man named Tobias Fletcher, who'd made a fortune selling human beings like they was livestock. He had a voice that carried over crowds, and a manner that could make murder sound like mercy. Step up, good folks," he called to the gathered buyers. "Fresh stock today, strong backs, willing hands, gentle dispositions guaranteed by the finest management in the state." One by one, the condemned were brought up onto the platform. Old Solomon, who'd taught secret reading lessons and paid for it with his life, had left behind a grandson named Isaac, barely 12 years old but tall for his age. The boy stood straight despite his terror, his eyes searching the crowd for familiar faces that might bid to keep him close to home. "Fine boy here," Fletcher announced, grabbing Isaac's arm and displaying him like prize cattle. "Strong as a mule, smart as a whip, perfect for housework or field training. Who'll start the bidding at $200? The bidding began, voices calling out numbers that represented everything Isaac had ever known or hoped to know. 250, 300, 375. Each increase in price was a step farther from home, farther from the graves of his ancestors, farther from any hope of seeing familiar faces again. Abigail watched from her place in the slave crowd, feeling something crack inside her chest like ice breaking up in spring. She'd known Isaac since he was born, had helped his grandmother deliver him on a night when the midwife couldn't come, had watched him take his first steps, heard his first words, seen him grow from baby to boy to this terrified child standing on the auction block like a lamb prepared for slaughter. 400, called a voice from the crowd. The man who spoke wore clothes that marked him as a rice planter from the coastal lowlands, the kind of man whose slaves died young from malaria and overwork in the flooded fields. Isaac's face went gray as ash, understanding what that particular buyer would mean for his future. 425. Another voice, this one belonging to a sugar planter from down in the Louisiana bayous, where the work was so brutal that slaves was expected to last maybe 7 years before the swamp fevers and crushing labor killed them. Either way, Isaac was being sold into a death sentence, just a question of whether it would come quick or slow. That's when something happened that folks who was there still talk about in whispers, when the night grows dark and the Spanish moss sways like ghosts in the wind. Abigail felt her grandmother's spirit rise up inside her, felt the presence of all them ancestors who died in chains, felt the weight of every child sold away from their mama's arms, and every parent who died grieving for babies they'd never see again. The crack in her chest split wide open, and out of it poured a sound that started low as distant thunder and rose till it filled the whole auction yard. Not quite singing, not quite screaming, but something in between that carried the accumulated grief of generations. It was the sound of every spiritual sung in secret, every prayer whispered in the dark quarters, every lament that had no words because the pain was too deep for language. Other voices joined hers. First the women, recognizing something ancient and holy in that sound, adding their own grief to the chorus. Then the men, deep voices that had known the whip and the brand and the iron collar. Then even some of the children, too young to understand what they was witnessing, but old enough to feel the power moving through the crowd like electricity before a storm. The white folks in the auction yard fell silent, struck dumb by something they'd never heard before and didn't understand. This wasn't rebellion in any sense they could recognize or punish. This wasn't resistance they could fight with whips and guns and laws. This was something deeper and older and more dangerous than anything they'd prepared for. It was the sound of human souls refusing to be silent anymore. Master Caldwell pushed through the crowd toward Abigail, his face red with rage and something that looked like panic. "Stop this!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed up by the growing chorus, lost in the sound of accumulated suffering finally finding its voice. "Stop this at once!" But Abigail couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, didn't want to stop. All them years of forced silence, all them brandings endured without screaming, all them lessons in submission and obedience. Everything was pouring out of her in this moment like water bursting through a broken dam. She was singing for Isaac and for Solomon, and for every child who'd stood on that platform, and every parent who'd watched helplessly from the crowd. The song, if it could be called a song, carried words in languages that predated English, carried rhythms that remembered Africa, carried melodies that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery, and generations of forced forgetting. It was the sound of memory itself refusing to die, the sound of humanity asserting itself in a place designed to deny that humanity existed. For maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15, time moved strange during that singing. The Charleston auction ground was transformed into something it had never been before, a place where the voices of the enslaved rose higher than the voices of their masters, where the accumulated pain of centuries found expression, where the price of human flesh was drowned out by the sound of human souls declaring their own worth. Then, the moment passed. Master Caldwell reached Abigail and struck her hard across the face, hard enough to split her lip and send her stumbling. The other masters and overseers moved through the crowd with whips and clubs, restoring order with the brutal efficiency that slavery required to function. But something had changed that day, something that couldn't be unchanged by violence or threats or any amount of punishment. Everyone present had heard what happened when human beings stopped accepting their own degradation, had witnessed the power that lived inside even the most oppressed soul when that soul decided to speak its truth. Isaac was eventually sold to the rice planter for $450. As he was led away in chains, his eyes found Abigail's across the crowd, and in that glance passed an understanding that would outlive both of them, that some things couldn't be bought or sold, that some sounds couldn't be silenced forever, that some truths were stronger than any system built to deny them. That night, back at the plantation, Master Caldwell called Abigail to the iron room for an emergency lesson in proper behavior. But as he heated his iron and selected his tools, something in her eyes told him that his 400 previous lessons had taught her things he never intended her to learn. The iron was ready. The room was prepared. The master and his student faced each other across years of accumulated pain and rage, and something that might have been justice waiting to be born. But this time, when the lesson began, it wouldn't end the way either of them expected. The day when the iron sang its loudest song dawned gray and heavy, with storm clouds building over the Mississippi, like the gathered anger of every ancestor who died in chains. The air hung thick as molasses, pressing down on the plantation with a weight that made even the mockingbirds fall silent, and the Spanish moss hang motionless as funeral shrouds. This was the kind of weather that made old slaves mutter about omens and conjure women retreat to their cabins to burn protective herbs and whisper prayers in languages older than Christianity. But Master Caldwell noticed none of these signs, blinded as he was by his rage over the scene at the Charleston auction. For 3 days he'd brooded in his study, pacing the floor like a caged panther, reviewing his journals and muttering about the unpredictable nature of slave psychology. The sound that had risen from Abigail's throat in that auction yard haunted him like a fever dream, challenging everything he believed about control and submission and the proper order of things. How dare she? How dare any of them? He'd spent years perfecting his methods, had studied under the best minds in the business of human management, had refined cruelty into an exact science. His plantation was famous throughout the state for the discipline of his slaves, for the efficiency of his production, for the complete absence of the kind of troublesome rebelliousness that plagued lesser establishments. And yet this one girl, this one marked and branded piece of property, had somehow found the audacity to sing her defiance in public, to inspire others to join their voices to hers, to remind the world that slaves had souls that couldn't be completely crushed. The humiliation burned in his chest like acid. Other planters had witnessed his loss of control, had seen his property behave in ways that reflected poorly on his management techniques. Questions would be asked, doubts would be raised about his methods and his authority. The reputation he'd spent decades building could crumble if word spread that Harrison Caldwell couldn't control one scarred girl who should have been broken long ago. No, this couldn't stand. This wouldn't stand. Order had to be restored, authority reestablished, and Abigail taught a lesson so severe, so complete, so devastating that she would never again dare to lift her voice except in absolute submission. The 400 previous brandings had been mere preparation, gentle instruction compared to what he would do now. This time he would use every tool at his disposal, every technique he'd learned, every innovation he'd developed over years of study and practice. The iron room had been prepared with special care, as if for a sacred ceremony. Every tool cleaned and sharpened, every instrument laid out in precise order, the forge heated to perfect temperature. Master Caldwell had spent hours selecting just the right iron for this occasion. Not one of his standard marking tools, but something special he'd commissioned from the finest metalworker in New Orleans. A brand that would leave a mark unlike any other. A signature that would remind Abigail of this day every time she moved, every time she breathed, every time she dared to think thoughts that belonged to free people rather than property. When the overseer came for her that morning, Abigail was working in the kitchen garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of vegetables that would feed the big house table. Her hands moved with mechanical precision through familiar tasks, but her mind was elsewhere, traveling paths that Master Caldwell had never mapped and could never control. She thought about Isaac, sold away to die in the rice fields of Carolina. She thought about Solomon, dead for the crime of teaching children to read. She thought about all the voices that had joined hers in that moment at the auction, all the souls who had found the courage to sing their pain instead of swallowing it silent. "Come on, girl," Malcolm Burke said, his voice carrying less authority than usual, as if even he understood that something had changed in the balance of power on the plantation. "Master wants to see you in the special room." But there was something in his eyes that looked almost like pity, and Abigail realized that word had spread among the white folks too, about what Master Caldwell was planning for her. The walk to the iron room felt different this time. Instead of the familiar dread, Abigail found herself filled with a strange calm, a stillness that came from someplace deeper than fear. Her grandmother's spirit moved with her, and her great-grandmother's spirit, and the spirits of all the women who'd walked similar paths before her, who'd faced similar choices between submission and something else entirely. Their strength flowed through her like water flowing through parched earth, filling spaces in her soul that pain had carved out over the years. Master Caldwell waited inside the stone building, dressed in his finest clothes as if for church or court, or some other solemn occasion. The forge glowed red in the corner, and multiple irons rested in the coals, their handles wrapped in leather to protect the hands that would wield them. But it was the look in his eyes that told Abigail everything she needed to know about his intentions. This wasn't going to be just another branding. This was going to be an attempt at complete and total destruction, a final solution to the problem of her unbroken spirit. "Sit down, Abigail," he said, his voice carrying a terrible gentleness that was more frightening than any shout. "We have a great deal to discuss today, about respect, about obedience, about the consequences of forgetting one's proper place in the natural order of things." He gestured toward the chair that had been bolted to the floor, its arms fitted with leather straps worn smooth by countless struggles. But Abigail didn't move toward the chair. Instead, she stood in the doorway, looking around the room that had been the site of so much of her education in pain. She saw the tools of Master Caldwell's trade arranged with surgical precision, saw the stains on the stone floor that no amount of scrubbing had ever completely removed, saw the forge where iron was transformed from cold metal into instruments of human suffering. And for the first time in her life, she saw it all not as the kingdom of an all-powerful master, but as the workshop of a man whose power depended entirely on other people's willingness to submit to it. "I said sit down," Master Caldwell repeated, his voice carrying an edge now. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. You know what happens when you resist. You know how much worse I can make it for you. 400 times you've learned this lesson, and today you'll learn it again until it finally takes hold." Still, Abigail didn't move. She stood there in the doorway like a statue carved from stone, her body bearing the marks of every previous lesson, but her spirit somehow intact, somehow stronger than it had been when she first entered this room as a terrified child. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. "Your silence won't protect you," Master Caldwell said, moving toward the forge where his special iron waited. "Your stillness won't save you. I have tools for breaking the most stubborn spirit, methods for crushing the most defiant soul. Before this day ends, you'll beg for my mercy. You'll weep for my forgiveness. You'll promise me anything if I'll just stop the pain." But as he spoke these words, something strange happened. His hand trembled as he reached for the iron, his voice cracked on the word mercy, and Abigail saw what she'd been learning to see for months now. Fear. Master Harrison Caldwell, gentleman planter and scientist of human suffering, was afraid. Afraid that his methods weren't working. Afraid that his authority was an illusion. Afraid that the woman standing in his doorway had learned something from her pain that he'd never intended to teach. The iron sang as he lifted it from the forge, glowing white-hot and ready for its work. Steam rose from its surface, and the air around it shimmered with heat. Master Caldwell turned toward Abigail with the tool of his trade in his hand, expecting to see the familiar resignation in her eyes, the acceptance of inevitable suffering that had marked every previous session. Instead, he saw something that chilled his blood despite the heat from the forge. He saw eyes that looked at him not as a god or a master or even a monster, but as a man. A weak, frightened man whose power was nothing more than the ability to inflict pain on those who couldn't fight back. A man whose authority depended on fear, and whose fear was about to teach him that some lessons cut both ways. "Come here, Abigail," he said, but his voice had lost its command. Now it sounded like a request, almost like a plea. "Come and receive your instruction like a good girl, like the property you are." But Abigail had stopped being property the moment she decided that some things were worth more than avoiding pain. Had stopped being a good girl the moment she chose to sing her truth instead of swallowing her silence. Had stopped being afraid the moment she realized that death itself was preferable to living as something less than human. She took a step into the room, then another, but not toward the chair. Instead, she moved parallel to the wall, her eyes never leaving Master Caldwell's face, her hands steady at her sides despite the trembling that was starting to show in his. The iron in his hand grew heavier with each passing second, and the heat from it began to make his palms sweat through the leather wrapping. "I have been a good student," Abigail said, her voice breaking the silence like thunder breaking the quiet before a storm. "You have taught me much about iron, Master Caldwell, about heat and metal, and the way fire changes things forever. But perhaps it is time for the teacher to learn from the student." And in that moment, as the storm clouds opened above the plantation, and the first drops of rain began to hiss against the hot stones of the iron room, Master Harrison Caldwell began to understand that his most successful experiment had been too successful, that in trying to break one spirit, he had forged something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined possible. The iron was ready. The room was prepared. The teacher and the student faced each other across years of accumulated knowledge about pain and power and the price of absolute authority. But for the first time in the history of the Caldwell plantation, it wasn't clear who was going to be giving the lesson and who was going to be receiving it. The moment that had been building for years, gathering force like storm clouds over the delta, arrived not with thunder and lightning, but with a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Master Caldwell stood with the white-hot iron in his hand, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air that had blown in with the approaching storm. And Abigail stood facing him across the stone floor of the iron room, with something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. Time moved different in that room, stretched thin like molasses in winter. Each heartbeat an eternity, each breath a decision between past and future. The forge glowed red in the corner, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed too much suffering to be sanctified by any prayer. The air shimmered with heat and possibility, and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone once made. "You will submit," Master Caldwell said, but the words came out weak as water, lacking the iron certainty that had marked his voice for so many years. "You will take your punishment like the property you are, and learn the lesson I'm trying to teach you." But even as he spoke, he could hear the hollowness in his own words, could feel the foundation of his authority crumbling beneath feet that had always walked on ground he thought was solid as stone. Abigail moved then, not toward the chair or away from it, but in a slow circle around the room's perimeter, her bare feet silent on the cold stone, her eyes never leaving his face. She moved like water flows around obstacles, like wind moves through trees, like something that had learned to navigate around power instead of submitting to it. And with each step she took, Master Caldwell felt something shift in the balance between them, felt the weight of absolute authority begin to settle on different shoulders. "400 times you taught me about iron," she said, her voice steady as bedrock, carrying no trace of the fear that had marked her childhood or the pain that had educated her youth. 400 times you showed me how heat changes metal, how fire transforms what seems permanent into something new. "You taught me well, Master Caldwell, better than you know." She paused by the wall, where his collection of tools hung in neat rows, each implement designed for a specific purpose, each one an extension of his will made manifest in steel and iron. Her fingers traced the air above them without touching, as if she was reading their shapes like letters in a book he'd forced her to study. "You taught me that pain is temporary, but scars are forever. You taught me that the body can be marked, but the spirit chooses its own masters. You taught me that a man who needs 400 lessons to make his point has no point worth making." Master Caldwell's hand tightened on the iron's handle, the leather wrapping slick with his sweat, the metal so hot it was beginning to burn through the protection and sear his palm. But he couldn't let go, couldn't lower the symbol of his authority, couldn't admit that the tool he'd used to write ownership on so many bodies had become too heavy for him to hold. "Silence," he commanded, but his voice cracked like a boy's changing voice, high and desperate and empty of conviction. "You forget yourself. You forget your place. I am master here. I own this land and everything on it, including you. The law says so, God says so, nature itself says so." But each word he spoke seemed to echo back at him from the stone walls, mocking him with the sound of his own desperation. That's when Abigail laughed. Not the bitter laughter of defeat, or the wild laughter of madness, but something else entirely. The laughter of someone who has finally understood a joke that everyone else has been telling without knowing it. The laughter of someone who has seen through an illusion so complete that even the magician believed in his own trick. "You own nothing," she said, still moving in that slow circle, still keeping just out of reach of the iron that trembled in his grip. "You own land that was stolen from people who understood that land cannot be owned. You own people who were stolen from their families and their gods and their homes. You own nothing but the fear you inspire and the pain you inflict. And both of those have taught me things you never intended me to learn." She stopped moving then, directly across from him with the forge between them like an altar where sacrifices had been made to false gods. The red glow lit her face from below, turning her scars into a map of continents he'd never explored, transforming the marks of his ownership into something that looked more like decorations worn by a warrior returning from battles he couldn't imagine. "I learned that a man who needs iron to make people respect him has no respect worth giving. I learned that a man who marks flesh to prove ownership proves only that he understands neither flesh nor ownership. I learned that power built on suffering is fragile as spun glass and twice as empty." Her voice carried no anger, no hatred, no emotion at all except a terrible certainty that chilled him more than rage ever could have. Master Caldwell raised the iron higher, as if the gesture could restore the authority that was slipping away from him like water through his fingers. "I'll kill you," he whispered, and for the first time in their long acquaintance, he spoke the truth about what he really wanted to do to her. "I'll burn you piece by piece until there's nothing left but charcoal and memories. I'll make an example of you that'll keep every slave on this plantation in line for the next 50 years. "Yes," Abigail said, nodding as if he'd finally said something sensible. "You will try, just as you have tried 400 times before, just as every master before you has tried with every slave before me. You will try to kill the thing in me that refuses to die, to burn away the part of me that you can never own. And you will fail, just as you have always failed, because you never understood what you were really fighting." She moved again then, but this time not in a circle. This time straight toward him, walking into the heat radiating from the iron, walking into the space where his power was supposed to be absolute, walking into the reach of the tool that had marked her body 400 times. And as she walked, Master Caldwell found himself backing away, found himself retreating before the advance of someone who should have been cowering at his feet. "You were fighting my flesh," she said, still advancing as he retreated. "Marking my body, burning my skin, trying to write your name on something that was never yours to write on. But flesh heals, Master Caldwell. Scars fade, pain passes. What you never understood is that every mark you made taught me something new about endurance, something new about the difference between the body that suffers and the spirit that chooses how to respond to suffering." His back hit the wall behind him, cold stone that offered no escape, no retreat from the woman who had somehow become something more dangerous than any rebellion he'd ever imagined. The iron in his hand felt impossibly heavy, burning through the leather to blister his palm, but he couldn't lower it, couldn't surrender the symbol of his authority, even as that authority crumbled around him like a house built on sand. "Every time you heated that iron," Abigail continued, now close enough that he could see the details of the scars he'd given her, close enough to see how they'd healed, not as marks of ownership, but as proof of survival. "You taught me something about fire, how it works, how it spreads, how it transforms everything it touches. You taught me that heat makes metal soft enough to shape, but also that shaped metal can be harder than the original. You taught me your tools better than you ever learned to use them yourself." She reached out then, slowly, carefully, as if approaching a frightened animal, and placed her hand over his on the iron's handle. Her palm pressed against his knuckles, sharing the burn, accepting the pain as just another sensation in a body that had learned to separate sensation from suffering. And for the first time in either of their lives, Master Harrison Caldwell felt what it was like to be completely powerless in the presence of someone he'd always controlled. "Thank you for the lessons," Abigail whispered, her breath warm against his ear as she leaned close enough that he could smell the herbs she'd used to wash her hair, could see the pulse beating steady in her throat, could feel the strength in fingers that had learned to hold on to hope through 400 attempts to tear it away from her. But I think it's time for the student to become the teacher. What happened next happened too fast for Master Caldwell's mind to follow, too quick for his body to resist, too complete for his spirit to deny. The iron changed hands not through violence or struggle, but through a simple shift in will, a transfer of authority that left him holding nothing while she held everything. And as the white-hot metal settled into her grip with a familiarity that spoke of long apprenticeship, Harrison Caldwell finally understood what he had created in his years of careful instruction. He had made a student so apt, so dedicated, so thoroughly educated in the science of suffering, that she now knew his tools better than he did, had taught her so well that she could use his own methods against him with a precision that his trembling hands could never match, had been so thorough in his instruction that she was about to graduate with honors he'd never intended to bestow. The iron glowed white-hot between them, ready for its final lesson, eager to write its last signature. And for the first time in the history of the Caldwell plantation, the teacher was about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the education he'd spent so many years providing. When the power finally bled, it bled quiet as morning mist rising off the river, quiet as Spanish moss swaying in still air, quiet as the last breath leaving a body that had carried too much pain for too long. Master Harrison Caldwell had always imagined that if his authority was ever challenged, it would come with shouting and struggle, with violence that matched the violence he'd used to build his kingdom of suffering. Instead, it ended with a whisper and the soft sound of iron finding flesh that had never known fire before. The moment stretched like eternity between them, Abigail's scarred hand steady on the tool that had educated her body in the geography of pain, Master Caldwell's eyes wide with the terror of understanding what his years of instruction had truly accomplished. The forge glowed behind them like the mouth of hell itself, casting their shadows long and dark against walls that had absorbed too many screams to ever be truly silent again. "Please," he whispered, and the word came out broken as a bird with its wings torn off, helpless as anything that had ever lived and died in that room. "Please, I'll free you. I'll free them all. I'll burn the papers, destroy the records, give you money to start somewhere new. Just don't—" But his voice failed him then, choking off in his throat as if his body had finally rebelled against speaking lies that even he couldn't believe. Abigail looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no hatred, no emotion at all except a terrible patience that spoke of lessons learned through repetition beyond counting. "You taught me that please is just another word," she said, her voice steady as stone foundations, calm as deep water. "You taught me that promises are air, and mercy is weakness, and pain is the only language that speaks truth. You were a good teacher, Master Caldwell, the best teacher I ever had." The iron in her hand glowed white-hot, eager for its work, hungry for flesh that had never fed it before. Around them, the storm that had been building all day finally broke over the plantation, rain hammering against the stone walls of the iron room like the drums of every ancestor who had died for the crime of being born, with skin the wrong color, in a world that measured human worth by the lightness of flesh. "You don't understand," Master Caldwell said, pressing himself back against the wall as if he could merge with the stone and disappear into the very foundation of the building he'd used to break so many spirits. "I was doing God's work, maintaining order, keeping the natural balance between the races. Everything I did was legal, was right, was necessary for the proper functioning of society itself. I understand perfectly," Abigail replied, stepping closer. Close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from the iron, close enough to see the scars that covered her dark skin like a map of every continent he'd never explored. "You taught me to understand. 400 lessons in understanding. 400 demonstrations of how power works when it goes unchecked. 400 examples of what happens when one human being believes he has the right to own another." She paused then, studying his face with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen, seeing not the master who had terrorized her childhood and marked her flesh, but just a man, weak and frightened and small, whose authority had never been anything more substantial than the willingness of others to submit to his cruelty. "You taught me that the only difference between master and slave is who holds the iron. and you taught me very well how to hold it." What happened next would be whispered about in slave quarters from Louisiana to Virginia, passed down through generations like a sacred story, like a promise that someday justice would find its way even into the darkest corners of human cruelty. The iron moved with surgical precision, guided by hands that had learned through suffering to separate pain from panic, that had discovered through repetition the exact pressure needed to leave permanent marks without causing death. Master Caldwell's scream echoed off the stone walls and seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, seemed to crack the bedrock of certainty on which his entire world had been constructed. But Abigail had learned from the best teacher that silence was more powerful than screaming, that endurance spoke louder than protest, that taking pain without begging was the truest form of resistance against those who dealt in human suffering for profit. The iron found his chest first, right above the heart that had pumped blood through veins that had never known what it felt like to be considered property. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, acrid and sweet and terrible, the same smell that had marked so many of Abigail's own lessons, but now writing its signature on skin that had never known such education. The letter A for Abigail burned deep enough to last forever, deep enough to remind him with every breath of the student who had learned his lessons too well. "This is for Solomon," she said as the iron found flesh again, this time marking his shoulder with precision that spoke of long practice, of muscles that had learned to work despite pain, of hands that had been steadied by suffering until they could perform any task without trembling. "Who died for teaching children that there was a world beyond the one you created for us." The iron moved again, marking his arm with the careful attention to detail that Master Caldwell had always insisted upon, the kind of thoroughness that left no doubt about the permanence of the lesson being taught. "This is for Isaac," Abigail said, her voice never rising above a whisper, never showing the strain of the work she was doing. "Sold away to die in rice fields because you needed money for new curtains in the big house." Again the iron moved, again flesh sizzled under its kiss, again Master Caldwell learned what his 400 students had learned before him. That pain was indeed a language, but not the language he had thought he was teaching. "This is for my grandmother," Abigail said, marking his other arm with the same careful precision, "who died dreaming of flying back to Africa because you stole her wings and clipped them down to stumps." The lessons continued, methodical as clockwork, precise as surgery, educational as everything Master Caldwell had ever prided himself on teaching. Each mark carried a name, a memory, a debt that had been accumulating interest for years in the ledger of human suffering that he had never bothered to balance. The iron wrote its signature over and over on flesh that had never known fire, teaching lessons that would last as long as the man who received them drew breath. But it was when the iron found his back, when Master Caldwell felt the full weight of the tool that had educated so many others in the meaning of absolute powerlessness, that something broke inside him more completely than bone or flesh could ever be broken. Not his body. That was merely being educated in truths he had taught others. What broke was the illusion that had sustained him through years of cruelty, the belief that his authority was somehow natural, ordained, permanent. "This is for me," Abigail said as the iron completed its work, as the smell of burned flesh mixed with the scent of rain and storm, and the sweet smell of Spanish moss carried on wind that seemed to whisper the names of every soul who had died in bondage. For the child who believed that suffering had meaning, for the girl who thought that submission would bring mercy, for the woman who learned that some lessons can only be taught with fire. When it was finished, when the iron had cooled and the immediate screaming had died down to whimpers, Master Caldwell lay on the stone floor of his own torture chamber, marked with burns that would remind him for the rest of his life that power was nothing more than the temporary ability to inflict pain on those who couldn't fight back. His skin bore the same permanent signatures that he had written on so many others, the same lessons in ownership and authority, and the price of resistance. But unlike his students, who had learned to endure their markings with dignity, Master Caldwell wept. Wept for his pain, wept for his lost authority, wept for the world he had built that was crumbling around him like ash in the wind. And as he wept, Abigail stood over him with the iron still warm in her hands, looking down at the man who had thought himself God, and seeing only what he had always been, human, weak, and finally subject to the same laws he had used to justify his cruelty to others. "Now you know," she said, setting the iron down beside his head where he could see its glowing tip, where he could smell the heat that still rose from metal that had learned to serve different masters. "Now you understand what 400 lessons feels like from the other side, what it means to carry permanent marks that remind you every day of your place in someone else's version of the natural order." She turned then and walked toward the door, leaving him there in the room where he had educated so many others in the meaning of powerlessness, leaving him to contemplate the education he had just received in his own methods. Behind her, Master Harrison Caldwell bled onto stones that had drunk the blood of countless others, finally understanding that the iron had always been neutral, that it served whoever held it with equal dedication, that the only thing that had ever made him master was the willingness of others to accept his authority. The storm was passing now, the rain gentling to a whisper against the windows of the big house, and somewhere in the quarters the other slaves were beginning to understand that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power on the plantation. The iron had sung its final song, had written its last lesson, had graduated its most dedicated student into a teacher whose methods would be remembered long after the name Harrison Caldwell had been forgotten. Power had bled, authority had burned, and the natural order that had seemed so permanent had revealed itself to be nothing more than a lie, enforced by tools that served whoever was strong enough and smart enough and desperate enough to turn them against their former masters. The price of disobedience came swift as summer lightning and twice as merciless, falling on the plantation like the judgment of a wrathful God who had finally tired of watching his children suffer under the whips and brands of men who thought themselves equal to divinity. But the price didn't fall on who folks expected it to fall on, and that's a truth that needs telling before this story finds its proper end. Master Harrison Caldwell lay on the cold stone floor of his iron room for 3 hours before anyone dared to look for him. 3 hours of bleeding onto stones that had drunk the blood of so many others. 3 hours of understanding what it meant to carry marks that would never heal clean. 3 hours of learning that the body remembers pain long after the mind tries to forget it. When Malcolm Burke finally found him, drawn by sounds that carried farther than screaming ever could, the overseer took one look at the branded flesh and knew that the world he'd helped build had crumbled while he wasn't watching. "Sweet Jesus," Burke whispered, kneeling beside his master like a man finding religion in the ruins of everything he'd believed sacred. "What happened here? Who did this to you?" But even as he asked the questions, his eyes were already seeking answers in the scattered tools, the still warm forge, the iron that lay beside Master Caldwell's head like a serpent that had finally shed its skin. Master Caldwell couldn't speak for the first hour, could only whimper and shake like a child who'd seen the devil walking in daylight. When words finally came back to him, they came broken and strange, mixed with languages he'd never learned and references to things that no white man on a Louisiana plantation should have known about. He spoke of ancestors walking in iron chains, of rivers running backwards toward Africa, of drums beating messages that traveled faster than any horse could carry them. "She knew," he kept saying, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes staring at something Burke couldn't see. "She knew things about the iron, about heat, about how long flesh takes to burn before it stops healing right. She learned too much, learned everything I taught her and things I never meant to teach." His voice trailed off into mumbling that sounded more like prayer than speech, prayer in languages that predated English and Christianity and everything that European civilization had brought to American soil. Burke helped his master to the big house, half carrying the man who'd once ruled 700 acres and 400 souls with iron authority. But with each step they took, both men could feel something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power on the plantation. The quarters were too quiet, the fields too still, the very air too heavy with the weight of change that couldn't be undone by whips or chains or any amount of brutal discipline. Miss Adelaide Caldwell took one look at her husband's condition and fainted dead away, dropping to the marble floor of the front hall like a flower cut from its stem. When she came to, surrounded by house slaves who'd never seen their mistress show such vulnerability, her first words weren't about her husband's injuries, but about something else entirely. Where is she? Where is that girl who did this? What are we going to do about her? But that was the question that would haunt the plantation for days to come, because nobody could find Abigail anywhere. Not in the quarters where she'd lived since childhood. Not in the kitchen where she'd worked her last day of service. Not in the fields or the barns or the root cellars where runaway slaves sometimes tried to hide before making their break for freedom. She had vanished like morning mist, like smoke from a conjure woman's fire, like something that had never been quite as solid as the chains that were supposed to hold her. The other slaves knew where she'd gone, but knowing and telling were different things entirely, especially when the telling might bring down punishment on everyone who'd ever shared a cabin with her, or broken bread at her table, or listened to her voice joining theirs in the spirituals they sang when white folks weren't listening. Their silence was complete and impenetrable, a wall of shared understanding that no amount of questioning could breach. Burke organized search parties that combed the swamps and bayous for miles around, following trails that led nowhere, and tracks that disappeared into standing water where alligators waited like ancient gods with teeth like broken bottles. He brought in dogs from neighboring plantations, bloodhounds trained to follow human scent through any terrain. But the dogs whined and refused to follow any trail that led away from the quarters, as if they understood something about the nature of the quarry that their handlers couldn't grasp. Paddy rollers rode the roads with orders to stop and question any black woman traveling without proper papers, but they found nothing except field hands going about their lawful business, and house servants running errands for masters who were growing increasingly nervous about the strange atmosphere that had settled over the entire parish. Word of what had happened at the Caldwell plantation spread like wildfire through the network of gossip and rumor that connected every big house to every slave quarter within 50 miles. Other plantation owners came calling, ostensibly to offer sympathy and support, but actually to see for themselves whether the rumors could possibly be true. Had a slave really turned the tools of discipline back on her master? Had the natural order really been reversed so completely that the branded had become the one who wielded the brand? And if such things could happen on Harrison Caldwell's plantation, the model of efficiency and control that other planters aspired to emulate, what did that mean for the stability of the entire system? They found Master Caldwell changed in ways that went far beyond the physical marks that covered his body. The man who had once discoursed with scientific precision about the psychology of slave management now flinched when house servants approached too quickly, now started at sounds that had never bothered him before, now spoke in whispers about things that proper Christian gentlemen weren't supposed to believe in. He talked about root work and conjure, about African gods that had crossed the ocean in slave ships, about powers that white men had never understood and never would understand. She wasn't just marked, he told his visitors, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man who had seen too far behind the curtain that separated the world he thought he knew from the world that actually existed. She was transformed, changed into something that we never accounted for in our calculations, something that our methods weren't designed to handle. We thought we were breaking spirits, but we were forging something else entirely. Dr. Edmund Cartwright, who owned the largest plantation in the neighboring parish, listened to these ravings with growing alarm. "You're not making sense, Harrison," he said, his voice sharp with the authority of a man who had never doubted his own mastery over his human property. "You're talking like some superstitious field hand. The girl was just an unusually stubborn slave who took advantage of a moment of weakness. Once we find her and make an example of her, order will be restored." But Master Caldwell shook his head with the slow certainty of a man who had learned truths that couldn't be unlearned, who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. "You don't understand," he said, touching the burns on his chest with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. The iron teaches, and we thought we were the only ones who knew how to learn from it. We thought pain only flowed one way, that suffering only had one student at a time. But we were wrong. The search for Abigail continued for weeks, expanding to cover 3 parishes, and involving hundreds of men who rode through swamps and forests, calling her name like they were hunting some legendary creature that might or might not exist. Rewards were posted, descriptions were circulated, and every free black person within 100 miles was questioned about possible sightings. But it was as if she had stepped out of the world entirely, as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed her the moment she walked out of the iron room. Some of the slaves whispered that she had flown away, like the flying people in the old stories that grandmothers told when white folks weren't listening. Others said she had walked into the river and been carried back to Africa by currents that only ran for those who knew the proper prayers. Still others claimed she had transformed into something that wasn't quite human anymore, something that could move through the world without leaving tracks that dogs could follow, or signs that paddy rollers could read. But there were also those who said she had simply walked north, following the drinking gourd through forests and swamps where she knew every route and stream, guided by stars that had watched over her ancestors, and protected by spirits that white men didn't believe in and therefore couldn't fight against. They said she carried nothing but the clothes on her back, and the knowledge that 400 lessons in pain had taught her, knowledge that was worth more than any freedom papers, because it came from inside where no master could ever touch it. The truth was probably simpler and more complex than any of the stories that grew up around her disappearance. Truth was that Abigail had learned not just how to endure suffering, but how to use it, how to transform pain into power and submission into strategy. She had learned that the iron taught lessons to everyone who held it, that fire changed everything it touched, including the hands that wielded it, that the difference between master and slave was smaller than either side wanted to admit. Most importantly, she had learned that freedom wasn't something that could be given or taken away by pieces of paper or acts of Congress or the goodwill of white folks who thought they owned other human beings. Freedom was something that lived inside, something that grew stronger with each attempt to crush it, something that could be branded and beaten and burned but never truly destroyed. The plantation limped along for a few more months, but the spirit had gone out of it like air going out of a punctured balloon. The other slaves worked their tasks, but without the mechanical efficiency that fear had once inspired. House servants moved through their duties with a distraction that spoke of minds focused on horizons that their masters couldn't see. Field hands sang different songs now, spirituals that carried messages about rivers running toward freedom, and underground railroads that carried passengers to promised lands beyond the reach of whips and chains. Master Caldwell tried to restore order through increased discipline, through harsher punishments for smaller infractions, through demonstrations of authority that grew more desperate with each passing day. But every time he raised a whip or heated an iron, he could feel eyes on him that reminded him of another pair of eyes that had watched him work, that had learned from his methods, that had graduated from his school of suffering with honors he'd never intended to bestow. The price of disobedience had indeed come to the plantation, but it had fallen on the master instead of the slave, on the teacher instead of the student, on the man who had thought himself invulnerable to the very tools he used to break others. And in the quarters at night, when the work was done and the white folks couldn't hear, voices would whisper the name Abigail of the hot iron, passing it down like a promise, like a prayer, like a reminder that some spirits couldn't be broken no matter how much fire was applied to the flesh that housed them. The iron had taught its final lesson, and the lesson was this: that power flows both ways, that teachers sometimes learn more than students, and that the tools of oppression can be turned against their wielders when the right hands learn how to hold them. It was a lesson that would echo through slave quarters across the South, carried on winds that knew no boundaries and remembered everything they touched. What cannot be burned lives on in ways that fire never touches, in places where heat has no power and smoke cannot reach. This is the truth that white folks never understood about the people they tried to own, the lesson they never learned no matter how many brands they heeded, or how many spirits they tried to break with iron and flame. They could mark flesh, but they couldn't mark memory. They could burn bodies, but they couldn't burn the stories that bodies carried. They could destroy the living, but they couldn't destroy the legacy that the living left behind. Even after the searches stopped, even after the rewards were withdrawn, and the paddy rollers moved on to hunting other fugitives. The name Abigail of the hot iron continued to spread through slave quarters, like seeds scattered by wind that knew exactly where each one needed to fall. It traveled the underground networks that connected plantation to plantation, carried by preachers who spoke in coded language, and traders who moved between properties buying and selling human beings who were never quite as voiceless as their owners believed them to be. The story grew in the telling, as all true stories do, gathering details and embellishments that made it more than just an account of one woman's resistance to one man's cruelty. It became a teaching story, a parable about transformation and endurance, about the difference between suffering that breaks the spirit and suffering that forges it into something harder than the tools used to inflict it. Each telling added new layers of meaning, new interpretations of what had happened in that stone room, where so many had learned the taste of hot iron. Some versions emphasized the precision of Abigail's revenge, the surgical exactness with which she had applied the lessons Master Caldwell had taught her over the course of 400 brandings. These tellings spoke to slaves who understood that survival sometimes required learning your enemy's methods better than the enemy knew them himself, who recognized that the most dangerous resistance was the kind that used the master's own tools against him with perfect technique. Other versions focused on the spiritual dimensions of her transformation, treating her time in the iron room as a kind of baptism by fire that had burned away everything weak and left only what was essential. These stories resonated with slaves who found strength in religious traditions that predated Christianity, who understood that pain could be a teacher if approached with the right kind of reverence and attention. Still other versions turned her disappearance into a mystery wrapped in folklore, suggesting that she had been transformed by her suffering into something more than human, something that could walk between worlds and move through spaces where ordinary people couldn't follow. These tales spoke to the deepest hopes of people who lived under conditions that seemed to offer no earthly escape, who needed to believe that freedom existed somewhere beyond the reach of earthly power. But all the versions agreed on certain essential points: that Abigail had endured what should have destroyed her, that she had learned what her teachers never intended to teach, and that she had used that knowledge to write her own lesson on flesh that had never known fire. More importantly, they all agreed that her story was not finished, that somewhere beyond the reach of plantation boundaries and paddy roller patrols, she continued to exist as living proof that some spirits could not be broken by any amount of suffering. The effect of these stories on plantation discipline was subtle but profound. Masters noticed that their slaves seemed less responsive to traditional methods of control, more likely to meet punishment with silence than with the proper displays of submission and remorse. House servants moved through their duties with a distraction that suggested their minds were elsewhere, focused on horizons that their owners couldn't see. Field hands sang different songs, spirituals that carried coded messages about rivers running toward freedom, and railroads that carried passengers to lands beyond the reach of whips and chains. Dr. Edmund Cartwright, who had dismissed Master Caldwell's warnings about the spiritual dimensions of slave resistance, began to notice changes on his own plantation that couldn't be explained by traditional theories of human management. His slaves worked their assigned tasks with mechanical efficiency, but without the cheerful compliance that had once marked their behavior. They answered when spoken to, but volunteered nothing beyond what was required. They showed up when expected, but seemed mentally absent even when physically present. "It's like they're all listening to something we can't hear," he confided to his overseer, a hard man named Marcus Finn, who had built his reputation on his ability to maintain order among even the most rebellious slaves. "Like they're waiting for some signal that we don't know how to interpret." Finn had noticed it too, though he was reluctant to admit that anything had changed in his ability to control the human beings under his authority. "They're planning something," he said, his hand resting automatically on the whip at his belt. "Mark my words, they're organizing some kind of rebellion, some coordinated action across multiple plantations. We need to crack down hard before whatever they're planning comes to fruition." But the crackdowns only seemed to make the situation worse, creating an atmosphere of tension that stretched taut as a fiddle string ready to snap. Increased punishments produced compliance but not submission, obedience but not loyalty. The slaves performed their duties but with a mechanical precision that somehow felt more unsettling than open defiance would have been. Meanwhile, in the quarters after dark, when white folks couldn't see or hear what passed between one cabin and another, voices continued to whisper the story of Abigail of the hot iron. Children who had never seen her face could describe her scars in perfect detail. Adults who had never been to the Caldwell plantation could draw maps of the iron room and explain the function of every tool that Master Caldwell had used to educate his human property in the meaning of absolute submission. The story became a form of resistance in itself, a way of preserving and transmitting knowledge that masters preferred to keep secret. Slaves learned not just about Abigail's specific acts of defiance, but about the principles that had guided her transformation from victim to victor. They learned about patience and observation, about the importance of understanding your enemy's methods and motivations, about the difference between resistance that brought down punishment and resistance that actually changed the balance of power. Most importantly, they learned that the tools of oppression were neutral, that iron served whoever held it with equal dedication, that the only thing that made masters powerful was the willingness of slaves to accept their own powerlessness. This was dangerous knowledge, the kind that could spread like wildfire through communities that had been taught to see their condition as natural and permanent. Dr. Cartwright tried to contain the spread of what he had begun to think of as the Abigail contagion by forbidding all communication between his plantation and neighboring properties, by ending the traditional gatherings where slaves from different plantations would come together for religious services or social events. But the networks that carried the story were older and more sophisticated than he realized, built on relationships that predated his authority and operated according to rules he had never learned to read. The story traveled through the songs that work gangs sang in the fields, carried in melodies that sounded like harmless entertainment to white ears, but conveyed detailed information to listeners who knew how to interpret them. It moved through the coded language that preachers used in slave churches, embedded in sermons that seemed to focus on biblical themes, but actually transmitted practical knowledge about resistance and escape. It spread through the network of traders and craftsmen who moved between plantations on legitimate business, but also carried news and messages that connected scattered communities into a larger whole. By the end of that year, the name Abigail of the hot iron was known in slave quarters from Virginia to Texas, from the rice plantations of South Carolina to the sugar fields of Louisiana. Each community adapted the story to their own needs and circumstances, finding in it inspiration for their own forms of resistance, their own dreams of transformation, their own hopes for a future where the tools of oppression would serve different masters. But perhaps the most profound effect of the story was not on those who heard it, but on those who tried to suppress it. Masters who had never questioned their authority began to have doubts about the permanence of their power. Overseers who had relied on fear to maintain control started to sense something in their slaves' compliance that felt more like strategy than submission. The entire system of slavery, which had always depended on the psychological acceptance of its inevitability by those it oppressed, began to show cracks that no amount of punishment could seal. Master Harrison Caldwell, who had inadvertently created the legend by trying so hard to destroy the woman who became its center, lived the rest of his days as a reminder of what could happen when the relationship between master and slave was reversed. His scars never healed properly, remaining angry and red long after the initial burning, serving as permanent reminders that the iron was indeed a teacher, but not always the teacher that those who wielded it intended to be. He died 3 years later, some said from infections that started in his brands and spread through his bloodstream like poison. Others claimed he died of fear, of the constant terror of encountering other eyes that looked at him the way Abigail's had looked in those final moments in the iron room. But however he died, his death was seen by many as proof that some debts cannot be escaped, that some lessons continue teaching long after the original instruction is completed. The plantation was sold to pay his debts. The slaves scattered to other properties where they carried with them the story of the woman who had learned her master's lessons too well. And in slave quarters throughout the South, Grandmothers continued to tell children about Abigail of the hot iron, about the 400 lessons that had transformed suffering into wisdom, about the day when student became teacher and the iron learned to serve different hands. Her name became a promise whispered in the dark, a reminder that no system of oppression was permanent, that the tools used to break spirits could be turned against their wielders by those who learned to hold them properly. It became proof that freedom was not something that could be given or taken away by those who claimed to own other human beings, but something that lived inside where no brand could reach it, something that grew stronger with each attempt to destroy it. The promise that travels through generations carries more weight than iron chains and burns brighter than the hottest forge, passing from voice to voice like a flame that cannot be extinguished by any earthly wind. It moves through time the way water moves through stone, slowly but persistently, wearing away at foundations that seemed solid as bedrock, until the day comes when everything built on those foundations crumbles into dust and memory. I tell you this story now, children of tomorrow, because some truths need telling even when the telling brings pain, even when the words scrape against old wounds like salt against raw flesh. I tell it because Abigail of the hot iron was more than just one woman who suffered and endured, and finally turned her suffering into a weapon that cut both ways. She was the embodiment of something that could not be destroyed, no matter how much fire was applied to it. The living proof that the human spirit has depths that no amount of cruelty can fully plumb. The years passed like seasons in a drought, slow and hard and marked by changes that came so gradually that folks didn't notice them until they looked back and realized that the world they remembered was gone forever. The plantations continued to operate. The crops continued to be planted and harvested. The slave ships continued to cross the Atlantic, carrying human cargo to markets where flesh was bought and sold like any other commodity. But underneath the surface continuity, something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between those who claimed to own and those who were claimed to be owned. The story of Abigail spread far beyond the parishes of Louisiana, carried by the networks that connected slave communities across the American South like invisible threads in a tapestry that white folks never learned to see. It traveled with preachers who moved from plantation to plantation conducting marriages and funerals, with traders who bought and sold human beings, but also carried news and messages between scattered communities, with runaway slaves who followed the Underground Railroad north toward freedom and shared their stories with everyone they met along the way. Each telling of the story added new details and interpretations, new layers of meaning that spoke to the specific circumstances and needs of different communities. In the rice plantations of South Carolina, where slaves died young from malaria and overwork in the flooded fields, the story emphasized Abigail's endurance, her ability to survive what should have killed her. In the cotton fields of Mississippi, where the rhythm of the work songs kept time with the rhythm of resistance, the story focused on her patience, her willingness to wait for the right moment to act. In the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the work was so brutal that slaves were expected to last only 7 years before the crushing labor destroyed them, the story became a teaching tale about the importance of learning your enemy's methods and using that knowledge against him. In the tobacco fields of Virginia, where some slaves lived in conditions that almost resembled freedom, the story served as a reminder that comfort was not the same as liberty, and that even relatively benevolent masters still claimed the right to own other human beings. But everywhere the story traveled, it carried the same essential message, that the tools of oppression were not inherently evil, that iron served whoever held it with equal dedication, and that the difference between master and slave was smaller than either side wanted to admit. This was dangerous knowledge, the kind that could transform the way people understood their place in the world and their power to change it. The effects of this transformation were subtle but profound, showing up in ways that masters noticed but couldn't quite name or understand. Slaves became more likely to resist punishment through passive means rather than active rebellion, more skilled at work slowdowns and tool breakage that looked like accidents but happened too frequently to be coincidental. They developed more sophisticated methods of communication that allowed them to coordinate activities across plantation boundaries, sharing information about which masters were cruel and which were relatively lenient, which overseers could be trusted, and which were dangerous. Most importantly, they began to see themselves differently, not as property that happened to be able to think and feel, but as human beings whose humanity had been temporarily denied by systems that depended on that denial for their existence. This shift in self-perception was perhaps the most radical change of all, because it meant that even slaves who never attempted physical escape had already begun the psychological journey toward freedom. The White South sensed these changes without fully understanding them, responding with increasing paranoia about slave rebellions and plots that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Laws were passed restricting slave movement and assembly. Punishments were increased for offenses that had previously been considered minor, and professional slave catchers were hired to patrol roads and waterways, looking for signs of organized resistance. But the resistance they were looking for was not the kind that could be stopped by laws or punishments, or increased surveillance. It was the resistance of minds that had learned to think beyond the boundaries that slavery tried to impose, of spirits that had discovered they could not be owned no matter what the legal documents said, of communities that had developed ways of preserving and transmitting knowledge that their oppressors preferred to keep secret. Dr. Edmund Cartwright, who had dismissed Master Caldwell's warnings about the spiritual dimensions of slave resistance, lived to see his own plantation transformed by forces he never learned to understand. His slaves continued to work their assigned tasks with mechanical efficiency, but the cheerful compliance that had once marked their behavior was replaced by something that looked like submission, but felt like strategy. They answered when spoken to, but volunteered nothing beyond what was required. They showed up when expected, but seemed mentally absent even when physically present. He died in 1860, just as the tensions that would soon explode into civil war were reaching their breaking point, never knowing that his slaves had been planning their own emancipation long before any politician in Washington began talking about abolition. They had been preparing for freedom not by waiting for it to be given to them by benevolent white folks, but by claiming it for themselves in small increments, by learning skills and making connections, and developing the networks that would allow them to survive and thrive when the legal framework of slavery finally collapsed. The war came and went, bringing with it the formal end of slavery, but not the end of the systems that had supported and sustained it. The planters found new ways to control black labor through sharecropping and debt peonage, through legal codes that criminalized unemployment and vagrancy, through terrorist organizations that used violence to maintain white supremacy, even after the legal basis for that supremacy had been eliminated. But the war also brought something else, the formal recognition of what slaves had always known but had been forbidden to say, that they were human beings with the same rights and dignity as anyone else, that their labor and their lives belonged to them and not to anyone who claimed to own them. This recognition was incomplete and often violated, but it represented a fundamental shift in the legal and moral framework that governed American society. In the decades that followed, as the children and grandchildren of slaves built schools and churches and communities that had never been allowed to exist under slavery, the story of Abigail of the hot iron continued to be told. But now it was told not just as a tale of resistance and revenge, but as a reminder of the price that freedom required and the vigilance that it demanded. Grandmothers who had been children during slavery told their grandchildren about the woman who had learned her master's lessons so well that she became the teacher, who had endured 400 brandings and emerged not broken but transformed, who had proved that the iron served whoever held it with the proper knowledge and determination. They told it to remind these new generations that freedom was not a gift that could be given or taken away by others, but a condition that had to be claimed and defended and passed down like any other inheritance. And still today, in communities where the memory of slavery lives on in family stories and local legends, in places where people understand that the past is not past, but continues to shape the present in ways both visible and invisible, voices still whisper the name of Abigail of the hot iron. They tell her story to remind themselves and their children that suffering can be transformed into strength, that knowledge can be turned against those who try to use it as a weapon of oppression, and that the human spirit has depths that no amount of cruelty can fully destroy. The iron teaches, as it always has, but the lesson changes depending on who holds it and who receives its instruction. In Abigail's hands, it taught that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that patience can be its own form of resistance, and that sometimes the most powerful response to systematic cruelty is to master the systems that create it and turn them against their creators. Her scars have long since returned to dust. Her voice has long since joined the chorus of ancestors who sing in winds that only certain people know how to hear. But her story lives on, carried in the voices of people who understand that remembering is itself a form of resistance, that telling the truth about the past is necessary preparation for creating a different kind of future. Listen well, children of memory. Keep these words in the safe places of your hearts where fire cannot reach them. Pass them down to your own children when the time comes, and teach them to pass the story on in turn. Because some truths are too important to be lost, some lessons too valuable to be forgotten, and some promises too sacred to be broken by the passage of time. The woman who suffered and endured and transformed her suffering into a tool of liberation speaks still to those who know how to listen. Her voice carries in the wind that blows through places where iron once marked flesh, where brands once wrote ownership on skin that was never meant to be owned, where the tools of oppression were finally turned against their wielders by hands that had learned to hold them properly. Remember her name, Abigail of the hot iron. Remember her lesson, that the iron teaches whoever is willing to learn its secrets, that power flows both ways when the current is strong enough, and that some spirits cannot be broken no matter how much fire is applied to the flesh that houses them. And remember this promise, the one that travels through generations like a flame that cannot be extinguished, that no system of oppression is permanent, that every tool of cruelty can be turned against its creators, and that freedom lives in places where no earthly power can touch it, waiting to be claimed by those who are willing to pay the price of learning what the iron has to teach. Who suffered, suffered. Who resisted, left memory. And memory we keep here, in the legends of the lost slave quarters.